Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. 1951 saw the publication of a very special science fiction book called Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. This was the breakthrough novel of a writer born in Birmingham in 1903 named John Wyndham Parks Lucas Bain Harris. He eventually became John Wyndham after using various iterations of his name. And Day of the Triffids was the book which propelled him to science fiction fame, often unfairly decried as part of a cosy catastrophe stream of British science fiction, which often included the works of people like John Christopher or Sam Youde, who wrote things like the Triffids. Very particular British skewed stories about the end of the world, the apocalypse. But they were felt to be cosy because they were sort of middle-class stories of middle-class people surviving in a world ravaged by disaster. Over the years, that view of that sort of fiction has changed, and I think, certainly if you read Day of the Triffids, it's quite a gritty, dark, terrifying and bleak apocalyptic world that John Wyndham has created. Day of the Triffids is my favourite book. Now, I'm not saying it's the best book ever written, I'm not saying it's a literary masterpiece. It is, however, an important piece of British science fiction history, and it's a book that I can go back to again and again. And it's a book that was part of a three-pronged 1975 experience, which set off in me this strange, morbid love of post-apocalyptic fiction, whether it's books, films, TV. At the time I discovered Day of the Triffids, the book, I'd just gone to college to do my A-levels, and the library was very well stocked, and the very friendly librarian there led me to the works of John Wyndham. I'd seen the 1962 Day of the Triffids feature film, more of which later, and I knew the story, and I devoured the book, and I devoured a lot more of John Wyndham's work. At the same time, on BBC One, more or less at the same time on BBC One, Survivors was airing. This was BBC's apocalyptic post-viral pandemic drama by Terry Nation. A video on that coming at some point, and I absolutely love that series and still do. And also at that time we had a children's series called The Changes, which was a story of society collapsing because of some strange baleful influence that causes humans to destroy technology. These three things all entered my life at more or less the same time. And that's why I love post-apocalyptic things to this day. I'm fascinated by stories where society collapses or the trappings of society are gone. And that's more pertinent than ever today with our reliance on the internet and technology and machines. However, Day of the Triffids was the one that started it all off for me. For those of you who don't know, and I hope most of you do, Day of the Triffids is the story of the Earth brought to its knees by two things. The first of all is some sort of meteorite shower or light display in the sky, whether it's the tail of a comet or something the Earth passes through. Everybody who looks at these multicoloured lights in the sky goes blind. At the same time, plants called Triffids, which have been bred in captivity, the origins of them are a little bit hazy, but these are plants that perambulate, they move, and they're carnivorous, and they feast on decaying human flesh. They've been penned and isolated, but when society collapses, the Triffids break free and start to prey on humanity. It's the Day of the Triffids. The story has been serialised on radio several times. There have been film versions. There was a version in 1962, directed by Hungarian director Steve Seekley, which is an interesting take on the story, but there were lots of production issues. The original version of the film ran to just 60 minutes, and then director Freddie Francis had to come in and add half an hour of extra material with two characters trapped in a lighthouse, totally unconnected to the main storyline, to bring it up to a 92-minute running length. Then there was the most recent version in 2009, two-part serialisation on BBC One that starred Dougray Scott and Jodie Richardson. Again, this updated the story and changed the story and did certain things to the story which modernised it and brought it up to date, but it wasn't the book. The version I'm talking about today is from 1981, however. It's the most well-remembered and well-regarded version of the story. It's from 1981, the BBC's six-part adaptation of John Wyndham's Day of the Triffids. So it's 1981 and the BBC adapt John Wyndham's Day of the Triffids for a six-part TV serial, 6 half-hour episodes, which are a huge success, pulling in audiences of around 8 to 9 million. Directed by Ken Hanham and produced by David Maloney, who was the producer of Blake 7. He was very much involved in the early days of Blake 7 and left Blake 7 to go on to do this particular series. I love this particular version of the story because it is the book. It very much follows the line of the book and the characters of the book. Any version of Day of the Triffids has to be updated because the book was written in 1951. And if you're going to tell that story now, you're going to have to reflect the fact that the world has changed, because there are certain cultural representations and certain social representations that wouldn't fly today. I'm thinking particularly of the character of Josella Playton, who's the young girl that Bill meets up with fairly soon after the catastrophe has occurred. Bill, of course, being our hero of the story. And in the book, she's a debonair playgirl who has scandalised polite society by writing a book called Sex is My Adventure. This is stuff you can't do today because it's just too hokey and it's too old-fashioned. So you update things. And I think certainly in this particular 1981 version, I think they updated that character and certain other things to bring it a bit up to 1981's expectations. The story of Day of the Triffids, then, as I've said, is the world is brought to an end by this light show in the sky that blinds everybody, and the Triffids, which break free from their compounds and start to prey on humanity. The story starts on TV with Bill Mason, who's played by John Duttine, who was a reliable TV presence at the time. He went on to appear in all sorts of TV shows over the decades, and never exactly a massive star name, but regularly turned up in guest roles, leading roles. He was a go-to, good, solid British character actor. He plays Bill Mason. He is a Triffid farmer, and he has been stung by a Triffid and temporarily blinded. Triffids are these huge man-sized plants. I'll talk more about them in this particular production in a bit. He's been stung by a Triffid. He's had an operation to restore his sight. He's in hospital. He's bandaged, waiting for the bandages to be removed so we can see if his sight has been restored. He's anxiously waiting for somebody to come and remove his bandages. And the night before, we see people very excited in the hospital looking out through the window at this cosmic light show, this dazzling kaleidoscope of colour that's raging across the sky. It's a light show that people will never forget. They certainly won't. And in fact, there's one particular scene, the character Dr. Soames, played by Jonathan Newth. He's watching this light show, and there's quite a telling moment where he sort of rubs his hand across the bridge of his nose as if he's suffering from something, and that sort of foreshadows what's going to happen. And the next morning, Bill waits for the nurse to arrive to remove the bandages. Nobody turns up. He's aware that sunlight is streaming through the window. The clock starts chiming. It's getting quite late in the morning, but nobody's turning up. So he makes the decision to remove the bandages himself. His vision blurs, but his sight is saved and he can see. So he gets dressed. He walks around the hospital and finds chaos. Everybody's blind. The staff, patients are blundering around in a panic. He meets up with Dr. Soames, who realises what's happened, and it seems that something has caused everybody to go blind. He can't cope with the thought of that, and he commits suicide by throwing himself out the window. Bill then begins to explore London, which is deserted. There's nobody around, everybody's indoors, everybody's terrified. He meets a few survivors who try to sort of rope him in to help them out. And eventually he meets up with Josella Payton, who's being attacked by this bloke who's using her because she's sighted, and he's using her as a sort of guide to try and help him find food. London has fallen apart. Society has fallen apart. And eventually Bill and Joe meet up with a group of survivors who have barricaded themselves into a nearby army barracks, making plans with other sighted survivors to move out of London and move out into the countryside. By various plot contrivances, Bill and Joe, who have come to rely on each other throughout a couple of episodes, are separated, and they're forced by a group of other survivors to look after some blind survivors. There are certain well-meaning other sighted survivors who think that help will come, and all that has to be done is for sighted people to help groups of blind people. But a disease spreads throughout the city and people start to die. Bill then battles to be reunited with Joe, and it's basically a road trip for a couple of episodes of him trying to find Joe and encountering the perils of Triffids and the greater perils of the darker side of mankind on the way. For fans of the book like me, this is the go-to version of Day of the Triffids because it is so true to the book. It does make those concessions. It updates certain things. Joe is a different sort of character. Certain characterizations are slightly different. But basically, it creates the incidents as we saw them in the book. The through line of the story is much the same. with a few minor alterations that don't disrupt the story in the way that the film version and the 2009 version did. And I can watch them quite happily. And the thing about Day of the Triffids is I adore that story, and the book means so much to me that I can watch any version of it, no matter what they do to it. But the 1981 version is terrific because, unlike a lot of shows that are made in the 70s and 80s, it stands the test of time visually because it isn't dependent on masses of colour separation overlay or green screen. It's very minimalist in terms of its effect. You've got the Triffids, which are very well designed by the BBC effects people. I think a chap called Steve Druitt designed them. And they're these man-sized things operated by actors with these sort of bowlers at the bottom of the plants that click against the base of the plants and make this eerie, terrifying, rattling sound. And you see them shuffling along, moving along. Very well done, very effective, and it still looks great today. There are a few model shots of like a Triffid farm with lots of Triffids in them, and you see shots of lots of Triffids descending on the house in the last episode. The effects are sparingly and effectively used. It's not about spectacle. And that's what I like about Day of the Triffids, because although it's called Day of the Triffids, a bit like The Walking Dead, the zombies aren't the main thrust of The Walking Dead, and the Triffids aren't the main thrust of Day of the Triffids. They're a threat in the story. Story really is about human nature, I think, and how easily society can collapse when something terrible happens, and how the darker side of society can rise to the surface, but also how altruism can come to the surface. Because even though Bill and Josella are separated and forced to try and help blind survivors in the city, the people who make them do it aren't evil. They are doing the best for the blind. They think that help is going to come. It's a forlorn, desperate hope, of course, because this is a worldwide disaster. But they aren't evil. They're forcing people to do things for the right reasons. And it's only later in the series that we see how that particular force has turned a bit more malevolent and a bit more into a fascistic regime that wants to dominate and force people into certain social positions that they don't want to be in. In the last episode, Bill and Joe are reunited. That's no spoiler. They're living in a farm with some friends of Joe who are blind, but they're eking out an existence in this farm. They can live there. They can fend off the Triffids, and they just live in this rural life. And then this new governmental organisation comes along and wants to split them up and put the sighted people in with different groups and change their way of living. And again, they're not necessarily evil. They're doing what they think is right, but they're causing disruption to people who have found their groove in this new world. As a production, then, this is just so well done. The scenes in the early episodes of Deserted London, I always find that stuff chilling when you see empty London streets. I think of things like 28 Days Later, those scenes of Cillian Murphy's character wandering across Westminster Bridge. There are no cars and no people. Harder to do that sort of stuff these days, I imagine. But there are some really effective scenes of deserted London streets. And episode 6 kicks off with a caption that says 6 years later and London is overgrown. And we see, done by simple visual effects, but London buildings are covered in moss and grass. There's abandoned cars and things. So haunting and evocative. And those scenes in the first episode, when we see people, they're terrified people who are clawing blindly at cans, not knowing what's in there. At one point, Bill and Joe are driving through London and they're besieged by a group of people, angry people who want their help, and they drag them out of the car. Those sorts of scenes are haunting and thrillingly done, and very simply done with no showiness to them. It's just, this is the situation, this is what the city looks like now, this is how people are behaving. And then we move out into the countryside, and that's when we start to see a bit more of the Triffids roaming around. And as I said, it's interesting that the Triffids aren't a major threat, but when they do appear, they're very effective. There's a scene where they attack a group of people that Bill's looking after. They're trying to forage in a greengrocer shop, and the Triffids just attack and they slaughter people. It's such a smart, well done production that's so sympathetic to the book and doesn't need to reinvent the book, because it appreciates that the book is a damn good story and it doesn't need much doing to it to sort of make it work. It's a terrific production. It looks great. Even now, over 40 years later, it still looks great. It almost has a sort of documentary feel to it. And the characterization is superb. It's 6 half-hour episodes, so it doesn't hang about. It's not like, hour-long episodes. It gets in and gets on with it. The whole story is done in 3 hours. But the acting is great. Bill Mason is really played very well by John Duteen. Emma Ralph plays Josella. She's a striking actress who, it's a shame she didn't really go on to do a lot else. She has a few other credits, but she abandoned acting not long after this. But she has a fascinating sort of look, facial structure to her. Sort of she's a tough nut, basically. A really interesting actress. I would have liked to have seen a lot more from her. We also get Maurice Colborne playing Coker, who is initially not an enemy of Bill, because it's not about enemies and villains, but he's one of these well-meaning people who wants to look after the survivors in London. He eventually becomes a friend of Bill's as they endure further adventures throughout the series. Maurice Colborne, who went on to be in things like Howard's Way, he achieved huge fame in Howard's Way a few years later. And of course he appeared in a couple of Doctor Who stories. We also get Gary Olson, much missed Gary Olson, who appears as one of the, I'm trying to call them thugs, one of the people who are trying to put the sighted people in with blind communities later on in the story. So it's a really good cast, a good solid TV actors, really good scripts. Anybody who's seen it will remember that haunting title sequence. The show, if you're interested, is available on Blu-ray. It came out a couple of years ago. A lot of people complained about the Blu-ray, said there were compression issues and picture issues. Looks fine to me. This is how it first came out, however. The old DVD release that came out back in 2005, which you can pick up, I'm sure, in places like CEX. This comes with a booklet, which is, I think, also included in the Blu-ray version. I have umpteen versions of the book. I have the novelization that was republished to coincide with the TV series in 1981, and I have various other editions of the book scattered around the house. It's quite hard for me sometimes to talk about something that I love as much as Day of the Triffids, because it speaks to me in a very special way, because it's a book which opened up a whole avenue of fiction to me, a whole avenue of storytelling that still exists. This, as I say, it's a morbid fascination with the end of the world, but I think it's something that's pertinent today, because we rely so much on all the stuff that's around us, and it would be so easy for that to be stripped away, for us to lose all that, and then to be, what do we do now? How do we do simple things without technology? When you put that with killer plants, you can't go wrong. Day of the Triffids is a great TV production. I would urge you to find it. It may well be on YouTube as well, but you can easily pick it up on physical media. And of course the book, never gone out to print. It's a terrific book. And the series is superb and has really stood the test of time. And I'm going to rate Day of the Triffids. I'm going to give it a big 9.5 out of 10. Why not 10? I don't know. But I think it's one of those things that when it ended, because the book and the series, they're open-ended. There's no solution. The Triffids aren't beaten back. Society doesn't get back on its feet. The world has ended, and it's about people finding a new life through it. And the Triffids are still a threat. In the film version from 1962, the new subplot set on a lighthouse resulted in seawater destroying the Triffids, which meant that at the end of the film, society was saved. Wyndham's book and the TV versions are much bleaker than that. Society has ended, but it thrives and survives, but the Triffids are still out there. It's great. I love Day of the Triffids, you may have gathered. Right, thank you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this video. There will be a lot more stuff coming up soon. It's been a weird few days. We've had various storms that have kept me out of the cinema room and various Christmassy things that have stopped me recording, but I'm back and there will be lots more stuff coming up soon. So if you're new here, why not like and subscribe? Press the like button, press the subscribe button. Look back at all the other videos that are on the channel. Leave a comment down below. It's great to get comments from you. I love getting your comments. So please engage. Engage. Let me know what you think if you've seen the Day of the Triffids. If you adore it like I do. You can't, because I love it more than you. But let me know what you think of this version of Day of the Triffids and any version of Day of the Triffids. Leave a comment. I will see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.